three of us got involved in this. The other two were non-medics, which was good because they knew stuff, and I knew a bit about medicine. Pat Casey studied history in UCD, and Kevin Cullen has already written a book at those who went to war from Monaghan, so he knew about publishing. Where's Oliver when I need him? Here. Are you going to move them on, or am I?
The right button.
Okay. So over 3,000 Irish doctors participated as medical doctors in World War I, an astonishing number, really. They constituted 25 to 30% of the workforce of the Royal Army Medical Corps. Of these, 105 were killed in action, 41 died from their wounds, and 21 drowned. And 76 died of disease while on service. When we started this, we looked at the Roll of Honour here, and we were astonished to find 1,266 names on the Roll of Honour. Now, of those who were on the Roll of Honour, 839 were qualified doctors, 180 were students who volunteered as soldiers, 247 were fellows. In other words, they had qualified and got their fellowship in this college, and that was the total. And the first question we thought about was why there were so many doctors and students from the College of Surgeons. Well, the college had a long history. It was founded in 1784 and supplied surgeons in the Napoleonic Wars, allegedly supplying 1,000 surgeons to the Napoleonic Wars. In 1910, the Royal Army Medical Corps, under the direction of its leader, formed officers' training corps in the major universities in the UK and in Trinity College, Dublin, and RCSI. The commanding officer here was Major Geddes, and Sir Thomas Miles, a very prominent member of the college, was on the committee. Dr. de Courcy Wheeler, who became very much involved in the home effort, was the adjutant. So 161 students enlisted by the end of 1911. And the object of this was to train students in the discipline of the RAMC and the discipline of the army, so that if war broke out, they could seamlessly join up. And of course, they were automatically called when the war broke out. Now, if we look at the number of medical students, and the College of Surgeons had a fair number of medical students each year, and a fair number of degrees each year. So the average intake was 40 to 50 per year. And the student population, we think, was around 250 students in the college. Now, the RCSI graduate numbers may be inflated because NUI really had just started in 1910, and many students went to UCC and UCG in particular, and some in UCG transferred after the half. In other words, after the first 2 years, transferred to the college or to Trinity. Some went to Edinburgh. Now, in the late 19th century, the armed forces was a good outlet for careers. And if you look at the number of RCSI graduates who were involved in one of the other parts of the of the armed forces, in July 1914, there were 175 commissioned. 143 in the Royal Army Medical Corps, 10 in the Royal Navy, 16 in the Indian Medical Service, and 6 in the Royal Flying Corps, which was really part of the Navy at that point in time. Now, doctors who volunteered got a temporary commission and were officers right away. After a year, if they behaved themselves, they became a captain. They were entitled to a horse and a batman. Batman being an orderly who took care of them, made sure that they had their medical bag and their uniforms and were cleaned. They were under medical army discipline, which was very important because it meant that no officer could tell them what to do. It totally depended on the medical discipline. So students could join as combatants, and many did. The Royal Dublin Fusiliers and the Leinster Regiment were popular. They could also join the Navy as a surgeon probationer. The advantage of that was that they were called doctor, they were paid, and the time that they spent there was 6 months. That was the commission. And they functioned quite well on the ships. They did minor surgery and they took care of coughs and colds, and they were always with a senior commander. Of course, when the war started, some of them were killed, and this was a big shock to the system. Now, when they finished their 6 months, they came back into college and they wore a pin which indicated they'd been in the Navy, which was said to have been a great help for getting through the exams. Now, junior medical students initially were welcomed into the RAMs, into the army, but later it was decided that they were going to need qualified doctors, so senior medical students were encouraged to finish their studies. In 1916, when the pressure came and conscription was starting in Britain, Lloyd Darby wrote to the college here suggesting that they shouldn't take any more medical students, but that they should be sent to the army. And the president of the time, Sir William Taylor, said this would be absolutely agreeable, provided all the medical students did it. He didn't hear any more from after that. Now, this is a list of students who served with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and as you can see, some of them didn't come back. The Boer War had been a disaster medically. They treated 22,000 wounded, and an astonishing number were treated for dysentery and typhoid fever alone. The medical advice on hygiene had been totally ignored. Water purification was very defective. Sanitation was deplorable, and rations were inadequate. So all these things led to a lot of illness, and it did improve the conditions for the doctors. Sir Alfred Keogh, or he wasn't Sir at that stage, Alfred Keogh became the director of the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was a Galway graduate, and it was he who set up the Officers Training Corps. It was he who set up research units, which resulted in the development of a typhoid vaccine before the First World War, and therefore there were only 8,000 cases of typhoid in the whole First World War on the Allied side. The Germans didn't take much cognizance of this until they had 30,000 cases in their first year, and then everyone got vaccinated. It was Sir Almroth Wright, a Trinity graduate, who developed this vaccination. Now, graduates of this college were involved in every theatre of war, but mainly on the Western Front, Gallipoli, and scattered around in other bits and pieces of the war. They were also involved in the naval battles. So the war started for these folks who volunteered. On the 14th of August, they sailed to France from Dublin and also from Cork. The first engagement was at the Battle of Mons. There were 100,000 in the British Expeditionary Force facing an army of 1.2 million. Of course, the army was spread out, so they were actually facing 160,000 Germans. They were woefully under-equipped. They had very few machine guns. There were 2 per battalion. The Germans had 8 per battalion. They retreated from the Mons, 250 miles, over 2 weeks, marching the whole way. It was a real slaughter. Now, their actual casualties weren't all that bad. Before they had turned up at all, the French had 70,000 casualties. We don't tend to see this. The Germans were very impressed with the British Army, which was small but very well trained. And in fact, they could fire 15 shots from their Lee Enfield rifles a minute, which was far more than you would expect. But it didn't compare with the 600 rounds per minute of the machine guns. And as you can see here, they went to Mons, and then they retreated very rapidly to the Marne. The French had 6 armies compared to the 2 small British armies. And when they got to the Marne, the French realized there was a gap in the German troops, and they exploited this gap and beat them back to the Seine, to the Aisne, I should say, which was 60 miles back. And then they started what's called a race to the sea. Each tried to outflank the other, and therefore trench warfare began from the Belgian border to the Swiss border. About 650 to 800 miles, depending on how, kilometers, depending on how you read it. Now, Charles Jalton was in charge of the #1 General Hospital, which left from Cork. And 9 days after arriving, he was hit by shrapnel. He was paralyzed, and he died. This was a real shock to the college. He was a very important person from the college's point of view. Charles O'Brien Butler, a famous Irish family, was a graduate in 1907 and joined up the RAMC. He had been to India. He was mentioned in dispatches for heroic work, but he was killed by machine gun fire on 31st of October. William A.D. Curran, whose picture you can see in Milltown Golf Club, or who's commemorated there, he was born in India, and his brother Stafford, both of them went to St. Mary's and then RCSI, and then joined the RAMC. His luck was different. He went all through the war, had no injuries, and retired in 1932. And here's a list of those who were commissioned officers who started off with the British Expeditionary Force, quite a number really. Thomas Crean was one of these. He was the only college graduate at that point who had a VC from the Boer War. He went to Belvedere, Clongowes, RCSI. He was a very famous international rugby player. He played in the British and Irish rugby tour of 1896, which later became the Lions. And he liked South Africa and stayed there and worked in Grootskoer in Johannesburg. And then when the war broke out, he re-enlisted. And he had already had a VC. He earned the Distinguished Service Order, a very high honor, in 1915, and was made the officer in command of the 44th Field Ambulance, which I will explain in a while. He had a habit of going out into no man's land. He was 6'4", and carrying 2 or 3 injured soldiers back. He was forbidden to do this because they felt he would be killed. He was injured 4 times, and eventually it told on him, and he had to retire early from the war. He then became the doctor's ascot, where he saved somebody's life by going out with the hammer and chisel, and a jockey who was knocked out and was comatose, he reduced to fracture of a skull with the hammer and chisel. He unfortunately took to the wicked drink. He was married to the daughter of a Spanish don who didn't like that arrangement one little bit, and he died an alcoholic at the age of 48. Sort of sad, really. Now, the armaments were extraordinary in the First World War. Abraham Lincoln had been shown a Gatling gun, which was the predecessor of the machine guns, and during the demonstration it blocked, and therefore he thought it was rubbish. Hiram Maxim was an engineer who developed the first gun which would eject a bullet and bring in another bullet at the same time. And this was a very successful gun, and that was what the Germans had. They had a lot of them compared to the British. The British had a Vickers gun, which was made by an engineering company named Vickers, obviously, and that was actually a better gun in many ways. It didn't stop as easily, and it was easier to cool. Artillery was very important in the First World War. Artillery was fired 6 to 8 kilometres behind the lines and required a lot of science to indicate where to fire it. And if an artillery shell came in here from a 16-pounder, which is the standard British gun, standard British artillery, it would take out everyone here. We might find a few shoelaces. They wouldn't find my glasses because I'd have lost them on the way in. As they went along with the war, they packed it more with high explosives. It also contained 360 bullets, but more and more they packed with high explosives, which made it more effective. Now, there were bigger guns. The Paris gun in 1918 was fired from the Marne, 125 kilometres from Paris, and the citizens in northern Paris thought they'd been invaded and started to leave town. They did this for 5 days before the gun was taken out of action. Gas, we all know about in the First World War, was terribly frightening, caused about 8,000 deaths overall, which is minuscule in the scheme of things, but it was very upsetting. There were not enough tanks, and they achieved relatively little. But if you were in the trenches as a German and you saw a tank coming over your trench, this was not a pleasant prospect. Planes were used a lot for surveillance, and later they learned how to shoot machine guns through the propeller, and then they were used fairly extensively. This is I was going to say a skinny version of me, but I don't think it is. This shows me beside a crater from one of these artillery shells. And this is 100 years later, and you can see the huge crater still. Quite astonishing, really. Now, the British hand grenade was the sort of thing that we see in the pictures. It was quite a good hand grenade, in fact. Shrapnel was what happened when you fired off an 18-pounder. Bits of the shell would form, and a decent bit of shell could take your head off or split your body in two. Not a good thing to come across shrapnel. These are the bullets which you'd find from a Lee Enfield rifle, and this is the classical 18-pounder, which was very effective. The only better artillery gun was the 75-centimetre French artillery, which was an astonishingly good gun. The Germans, with all their technology, their guns weren't as good. Now, John Singer Sargent was an American society painter. He did wonderful paintings of society ladies, both in New York and in London. And he came over in 1917 to paint the generals of the war. But just outside Albert, he saw these soldiers walking along, one holding the shoulder of the chap in front, and these had been gassed. He was so impressed by this that he did this painting. I forgot about the generals. This painting hangs in the Imperial War Museum, and if you ever go to see it, it's a very impressive painting. And this is some of the stuff that you see in the war. There's a big gun. Now, that type of gun would be used to reduce a fort or to knock a town out of action. On the upper right, you see the Maxim machine gun, and you can see that it requires a few people to run it. One person is loading it, one person is cooling it down, one person is telling them where to fire, and the other person is firing. Much later, they developed lighter machine guns, but that for its time was very good. You can see in the left lower one a tank, and a pretty rudimentary tank. Here you see Germans letting off gas. They did this in the Second Battle of Ypres very effectively, but they were as scared of it as the Allies, and they didn't advance after they'd fired the chlorine because they were afraid of it too, and therefore it wasn't of value. Overall, it wasn't great. The Brits immediately protested, but 2 months later had a huge amount of gas themselves. They started using it in the Battle of Loos in 1915, in September 1915, and unfortunately the wind was against them and it came back and took most of them out rather than the others. They also got the wrong spanners, so they weren't able to open the canisters. And finally, the Germans bombarded the area where they were storing the chlorine, and therefore they were injured most with it. But over time, they caught up and really did cause some damage. On the bottom right here is of great interest to Irish people because it's Parkgate Street where they were making artillery shells. And that continued during the war. This is an iconic picture of the beautiful town of Ypres with the cloth hall and the cathedral both obliterated in 1917. Now you can see the Western Front. The width of the whole war was about 50 to 60 miles, and it stretched mainly about 600 miles, but really about 400 miles of action. And these are reconstructed trenches that you can go and visit in Ypres. And this is a dressing station, a German dressing station near there. There were 3 battles of Ypres, and as a result, there are quite a number of students and graduates who are buried in Ypres. And this is a list of some of them who were buried in France. And this shows soldiers going over the top. When they went over the top on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, they marched, and they marched in line. They learned that this wasn't smart because the machine guns just mowed them down. The picture up above shows lines and lines and lines of barbed wire. And as you can imagine, that's not easy to get through. Artillery shells weren't effective at first at taking those out. And what about medicine? Well, when the war started, medicine was very limited. There were few vaccinations, very few effective drugs. Radiology had just started. In 1895, it had started, and interestingly enough, it started here in 1896. Post-operative mortality was very high due to infection, and of course, there were no antibiotics. Now, one of the things Sir Alfred Keogh did in his time as Director General of the Royal Army Medical Corps was work out a proper evacuation route for those who'd been injured. In the Battle of Waterloo, the famous French surgeon whose name I've forgotten, started evacuating people, but there was nothing systematic about it. The horse and cart came and took the injured away, but it wasn't systematic. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1903, 1904, the Russians actually started to evacuate people in a systematic manner. But really it wasn't until the First World War that it was done properly. So, if somebody was injured, they were brought back with the stretcher bearers from the no man's land to the regimental aid post. This was just first aid. It was run by a junior doctor generally. Then those who couldn't wait for that or who were able to make their own way back went back to an advanced dressing station where they had their dressings changed if they'd already been treated. And from there, the sick and the badly injured went to a casualty clearing station. The casualty clearing stations were 20 miles back for the first few months of the war, and they realized that they weren't very busy because most of their potential patients were dying. So they were moved up to 6 to 8 miles from the front, and that was much more effective. From there, they went to a base hospital, either for specialized treatment or because they were going to require hospitalization for longer than a few weeks. And from there, they went for either back to their unit or were transferred to the UK or Ireland by ship. We received 20,000 injured soldiers over the time of the war, and they went to 70 auxiliary hospitals, some of which you probably know, but many you wouldn't. The Royal Hotel in Bray was the Princess of Connaught Hospital for amputees. Headford Golf Club was for shell shock. I won't tell you which one was for venereal disease. Now, if there was a battle, and this is an outline of how the business worked. The first bit, ABC, is the line of battle. And the first bit there you see is the regimental aid posts, then the advanced dressing stations, and then the field ambulance, and then the casualty clearing station. The casualty clearing station was always beside a railhead or a canal. There were a lot of canals in northern France and Belgium, and those with many injuries were sent by boat because they didn't want them rattling around in ambulances. So the regimental aid posts were usually in the reserve trench, 80 yards back from the front line, but the doctors had to go up when there was any action. And it contained the usual sort of stuff. Dressings, all the soldiers had their own dressings, which they were meant to slap onto their injury right away. The doctor had more dressings. They had needles and syringes, analgesics, paracetamol and morphine, and tincture of iodine. Doctor would suture small wounds, dress larger ones. They would only amputate patients who were exsanguinating. They were usually sent back. They put splints in fractured limbs, and they got to know the men, reassured those who were shell-shocked and tried to help them deal with it. And they transferred the badly injured rapidly. For the first 2 years of the war, if you got an abdominal injury, they gave you a high dose of morphine and you died because there was no effective treatment. They hadn't noticed the very efficient way that the Russians had dealt with it in the Russo-Japanese War, which I hope I'll come to later. This is an advanced dressing station. The importance of this one is that John McCrae sat there and wrote his famous poem in Flanders Field when his good friend was killed just behind there. Now, fractured femur at the start of the war for the first few months had a mortality of 80%. And the reason was that the leg was tied to a long Lee Enfield rifle and bandaged and then carried along on a stretcher. And the bone edges banged against one another and the blood vessels which lay in between, and they essentially exsanguinated. Now, Hugh Old Thomas was a chiropractor, and Robert Jones was a friend of his, and Thomas developed the splint, which was based on the hip, and they put the patient in there and stretched the leg so that the bone ends weren't able to bang against one another. And they were transported like that, and then they generally went on barges to the base hospitals. And the mortality dropped in 6 months from 80% to 15%, one of the great successes of the war. The advanced dressing stations collected the seriously wounded. They corrected the splintered fractures. they might do amputations if they weren't too busy, and they treated the walking wounded, and they triaged the wounded. In other words, those with bad head injuries, chest injuries, and abdominal wounds originally were given morphine. This is a field ambulance. I thought a field ambulance was an ambulance in a field. It's not. It's an ambulance group containing 224 men and 10 officers. The commanding officer is usually a colonel from the RAMC, and the 10 officers were all doctors. They had all their own equipment, and their job was to site the regimental aid posts, the advanced dressing stations, and they were to collect the patients from the advanced dressing stations and bring them onto the casualty clearing stations. This is an advanced dressing station. An advanced dressing station wasn't anything fancy. Any place they could find a bit of protection, a bit of wall would do, and patients would get whatever treatment was available. The casualty clearing station was much more serious. They might have 500 admissions a day. They were always paired with another one, so that when one filled, the next lot could go into the second one, and 2 or 3 days later, they would have emptied the first one by sending them back to the base station, base hospitals, or else they would have died. They had a lot of deaths. And they were mainly doing amputations and wide debridement of wounds. They realized early on that gas gangrene was a huge problem, and the French had a lot of experience of this in the Franco-Prussian War, and they'd sort of forgotten about it, but remembered it pretty quickly when the war started. And they took huge, big areas around a wound and allowed them to heal by so-called secondary intention. And that really dealt very well with gas gangrene if they got them early. If they got them late, they all died. Again, there's another advanced dressing station, people lying around hiding behind the truck. And this is a casualty clearing station with all sorts of bodies waiting to get in to the Nissen huts or indeed the tents. And this shows a close-up of the same one. And when they had been patched up at the casualty clearing station, those who required further treatment got the trains or barges to the base hospitals. These are folks who seem to have got blighties. That's what they called wounds, which were enough to get you back to England, but not enough to have you sent back to the front line. Now, casualty clearing stations were not exempt from bombardment, even though they were clearly demarcated. Shells fired from 6 to 8 kilometres back don't distinguish them that easily, and some of them were bombed, and indeed soldiers and doctors and nurses were killed. This was the furthest forward where you could find nurses. This was a happy place to be. Base hospitals, they mainly did the major surgery. Experienced staff came. Sir Barclay Moynihan in Leeds used to hitch he had his own train, well, he had his own carriage, which he'd hitch onto the train on a Friday evening, bring him down to London where he'd have dinner with Lloyd George and take the overnight boat to Boulogne, and then he would operate for the weekend and come back on Sunday night. They had very distinguished people who gave their time free for this care. Harvard sent over a medical team, and Harvey Cushing was on that, and he'd already started a bit of neurosurgery, but he very much developed it during the First World War, and he developed the principle of operating on those with head injuries, cleaning out the bullets and the bits of coat and all the dirty stuff in the wound, and then closing up the dura, the outer layer, covering up the wound. And they had a 70% survival by the end of the war, which was quite extraordinary. Now, there was a Lithuanian princess who was Russian, who worked on an ambulance train during the Russo-Japanese War, and she operated on those who had abdominal injuries throughout that war, and she had a 75% survival. And the reason was that she only operated on those who were stable when she got them, so nobody had really noticed this, and it wasn't until 1917 that they started operating on abdominal wounds. And they realized that most of them died from bleeding. And if they got in there and dealt with it and were careful in the surgery and didn't get too many leaks, then most survived. Now in 1916, the British Army, the RAMC in fact, were very short of surgeons. So they sent out an appeal to all the major medical schools for more surgeons. And they appealed here to Sir William, well, he was later Sir William Taylor, who was the president at the time. And he got together groups from Dublin who went out for 6 months to this hospital, the 83rd Boulogne Hospital. It was known as the 13th Casualty Clearing Station, but then when the Irish doctors came along, they rebuilt it as, now when I say rebuilt it, they put up more tents. There were 600 beds, and every 6 months there were a group of surgeons, anaesthetists, pathologists and physicians who went there for 6 months, and it was very safe. They were specialists in eyes and facial reconstruction, and it was there that Sir Harold Gillies started doing the operations which made him famous for facial reconstruction. In relation to the war, there were some very important developments. X-rays really came into their own during the war because they could show the pathway of the injuries, and they could show which way you should fix bones. Wide debridement of wounds I mentioned. Typhoid vaccination was carried out on nearly all the soldiers, and the only people who got typhoid were those who hadn't been vaccinated. Tetanus vaccination, they knew about this from the Boer War, that everyone had to be vaccinated. Thomas's splint was used, and indeed was used until the 50s for the treatment of fractured femurs. As I said, the CCSs were moved forward. The stretcher bearer corps were identified as an important group. These incredibly brave people went out into no man's land to collect the injured under the watchful eyes of the Germans, who sometimes killed them but often didn't, because they knew it would happen to theirs as well. They were the bandsmen of the regiments, and they formed a separate group in 1916. The evacuation pathway was defined, and that's been the way ever since in other wars. And these are pictures taken in a casualty clearing station. They would have 3 operation tables together. There was none of this worry about MRSA, and they just died if they got infected. Some of the instruments which I got over here from the archives, well, I've seen some of those around over the years. And these were hospital ships. Again, these were torpedoed by the Germans once they declared war on the United States. They knew they were done for if they didn't have a quick victory, so they bombed and torpedoed every boat in sight. And these are some of the medals that college graduates got. GSO for Harding-Barry. And Sam McCausland was awarded the Military Cross. She got the Military Cross for one particular episode of extraordinary bravery. The DSO was usually a more complex thing, which you might get for a number of episodes, or else you always got the DSO if you were the officer in charge of a field ambulance, because it was regarded as very responsible. Again, the Military Cross for Thomas Duncan, and Surgeon Peter Burrows Kelly, who was from Wicklow, got the DSO on the first day in Gallipoli. He was on that famous ship, the River Clyde, which was brought into shore, and the Leinsters and the Munsters and the Hampshires regiments were meant to come out from holes at the waterline and then walk along ledges onto the shore. Well, of course, that wasn't the case. They were still out of their depth, and those who walked the plank, as it were, and got off died because they had 60 pounds of gear and they just couldn't swim. Of the Leinsters who were involved there, 1,100 from the Leinster Regiment went, 11 came home uninjured. It was appalling slaughter. Sir Peter Burrows was awarded the DSO. He treated, as you can see, 750 men in 2 days, even though he couldn't walk the second day himself. He then came home to, I can't remember where he was in Kildare. He was Quaker village. Anyway, he died 2 years later at the age of 31. And I don't know whether it was true. It said pneumonia on his birth cert, which I went and chased. But that could mean all sorts of things. It may well have meant the so-called Spanish flu. Now, the Battle of the Somme, the medical arrangements were quite extraordinary. And you can see the front line there was all regimental aid posts and advanced dressing stations. Further back, where I would have hoped to have been, you would have seen the advanced, or at least the casualty clearing stations, and then the stationary hospitals at Amiens and Toulon. And they were busy. They were very, very busy. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, there were 57,000 casualties and 19,000 deaths. And we think of that as catastrophe. In fact, the Allies won the Battle of the Somme after 5 dreadful months. And although they had awful casualties themselves, so did the Germans, and the Germans weren't able to replace them. So it was, in fact, a great victory. And this just shows you the Western Front, the dark, purple line shows in 1918 and the end of 1918, and the green line shows you the spring offensive. The Germans tried really hard to obliterate the Allies before the Americans joined the war, because they knew that numbers would count then. The Russians had surrendered, giving them 40 extra divisions, but Sir Douglas Haig, who many people felt was very hopeless, he encouraged everyone to fight with their backs to the wall in the spring of 1918. And it was his encouragement that helped turn the tide. Of course, the Germans had come too fast. They ran out of supplies, and they had slaughtered anyone who got in their way, but they had also killed all the livestock, so they'd no food to go back. And that's why they were driven back so quickly. This is a slide of the RCSI doctors who were killed on the Western Front. One of these was Joseph P Cim, whose cousin was a surgeon in the Meath, Michael P Cim. And he was standing outside a dressing station when a shell came and killed him. And there was a priest and another doctor inside the dressing station, and they weren't touched. So he had no known grave. Now, he was probably buried where he was killed, but another shell may have just taken all that away. And that happened ever so often. There are 100,000 people buried, 57,000 at the Memory Gate. They're not buried, commemorated, and the remainder in Tynecott Cemetery. And they have plaques on the wall where they are commemorated as doctors who died with no known grave. Now, Gallipoli was a disaster, an unmitigated disaster. And a lot of Irish doctors were involved. We don't know. We know about doctors, and we know maybe they went to the Western Front. We don't know their whole story. Some of them went to the Western Front, then went to Gallipoli, then went to Salonika, then came back to the Western Front. The original landing was in April, and V Beach there is where Peter Burroughs Kelly became a hero. And then in August they landed up in Suvla Bay, and that was the 10th Division who were killed there. And this shows you some of the troops, and you can see Sebhar, the fort there, where the Turks were merrily ensconced, shooting anyone who moved as they came across them, the beaches. They left after 6 months with 200,000 casualties of 600,000 who went, and it's thought that the Turks had 250,000 casualties. And this shows you some of the RCSI doctors who were involved in Gallipoli. Now, when they survived Gallipoli, they either went to the Med as part of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force to Egypt, or else they went up to Salonika. And I see Frank Keane there. His mother's cousin went to Salonika and then came back here and worked in the Richmond in a most successful career. But we don't know what he did the rest of the war. And I only know he was there because he was given the Order of St. Sava, 3rd class. Frank Keane wasn't very impressed with that. He thought that must be very lowly. In fact, there were only very few of those given out. They also fought in German East Africa, German Southwest Africa. I mean, they were all around the place, these folk. Some died in the Middle East, and you can see where they are there. Now, the Royal Navy was a most interesting place to be in the war. It was 98% boredom and 2% sheer hell. If your ship was bombarded, your chances of getting out alive were very, very little. For the doctors, it was a nice life unless you were bombarded, and you never knew when that was going to happen. The big battle, of course, was the Battle of Jutland, and there were a lot of lives lost in that, including quite a number of senior Irish doctors. The Lusitania had 2 Irish doctors aboard. The RMS Leinster, I didn't know about till we started doing this. The RMS Leinster was the mail boat going from Holyhead to Dublin, and it had just left Dublin 6 weeks before the war ended, when it was torpedoed with a lot of loss of life, a number of RCSI graduates, and a lot of doctors and nurses who were going back to the front, having been on holidays in Ireland. Now, we always think of the past, the presidents as very senior members of the college who wouldn't have anything to do with this stuff. In fact, there were a fantastic number of presidents who were involved in the war in one way or another. Starting off with Sir Thomas Miles, who was president from 1900 to 1902. So he was very senior by the time. I think he was about 58 when the war started. In 1914, before the war started, Edward Carson had been gun running up in the north, and he said, well, if Carson can do it, so can we. And he brought guns into Kilcoole with Erskine Childers. They thought Erskine Childers might be able to get his guns into Howth, so he took half the guns into Kilcoole and quietly distributed them. When the war was on, he was the medical director in the Richmond Hospital, a bit like Paddy Brown nowadays. He ran everything as far as I could see. And during the 1916 Rising, he treated the officers from the British Army and the rebels equally. He operated on both. The Viceroy, who was Sir John French at the time, who had been discredited on the Western Front, and Haig had taken over. He was here as Viceroy, and he sent a message to Sir Thomas Miles that he was going to arrest these rebels. And they disappeared from the Richmond in his chauffeur-driven car. I presume it was a Rolls in those days. Nowadays, much more humble cars are, not for Petty Bro, of course, but for the rest of us folks. But you can see very famous names in Irish medicine here. William de Courcy Wheeler gave over his private nursing home on 33 Fitzwilliam Street for the war effort. Ernest Guinness rented the house next door and converted that into a hospital as well. 58 beds, officers only. Lady Powerscourt, Lady Arnold, a number of ladies used to bring in grapes and snipe and pigeon and whatever else was going at the time. So the officers didn't have a bad time. Andrew